Hey, this is Dave Nalette. I'm so glad that you're interested in our Seeing Jesus More Clearly Bible studies. There is always something good going on here. If you want to learn more about the ministry, you can do so. Go into our website, bygraceinternational.com, and maybe you want to support what we're doing financially. If you'd like to be a part of that, you can go there as well, bygraceinternational.com/give. Thanks. We're wrapping up our series today on the divine mystery, and I don't want to leave you with the impression that we've covered all there is to say. There's so much about the mystery of faith, the mystery of what it means to truly follow God and to truly seek after the things that God's laid out for us, and really, leaning into the mystery, embracing the question, the wonder, the majesty of it all. But I want to wrap this up here and talk to you a little bit about the mystery of the cross, the mystery of the cross. And so, for those of you who claim to be Christians, who identify as Christ followers, as I do myself, the cross is really the centerpiece or the foundation of our faith. The cross is where redemption occurs. The cross is where, without the cross, our faith would be useless. Our faith would be in nothing. The whole point of Jesus' death on the cross is to show us that death is not the end. Jesus brings in the pain, and we'll get into these things here. But the cross is really the linchpin of our faith as believers. But one of the things that I think we need to be cautious about is, we've done so much to try to explain, to try to understand every little nuance and item that occurred spiritually, that occurred physically to Jesus, that, all these different pieces, we tried to quantify them and place them into different boxes, and this goes over here, and this is here, and so on and so forth. And, I think that while it is important for us to try to understand these things as best as we can, we do need to be cautious and not think that we've ever figured it all out. We've got it all together, and we've even looked into this in depth here. We did a series a few months ago on a number of the atonement theories and how a number of them try to explain things and get close in certain areas, fall short in others. How I believe some are closer than others, but really, what happens at the cross is like our ability to understand, to comprehend the magnitude, the weight of everything that occurred spiritually, of everything that was laid upon Jesus, or everything Jesus took upon himself, I should say. Our ability to understand it really pales in comparison to what occurs. In the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 2, Paul, speaking of the corrupt systems, right? The worldly ruled systems that put Jesus to death. He talks about that, he says that they didn't know what was going on, what was going to happen, the weight of what would have occurred, because if they had understood it, they wouldn't have crucified the Lord of glory. That's in 1 Corinthians 2:8. And so, this is Paul's, telling us that even the best laid plans by humans, the best, what is that phrase? The best laid efforts of mice and men, right? The best laid plans by humans fall short of our ability to comprehend it. And really, I think what occurs is that when we focus so much on trying to explain all of the various intricacies and the ways it all fits together, instead of just stopping for a moment and resting in the mystery, saying, I don't need to necessarily explain it all. Christ died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. Because we focus so much on, I've got to explain everything, it really stops us from living in the reality of what was accomplished, right? In the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, like we said earlier, every theory has these failures and shortcomings, the areas that they miss the mark in, right? There's no perfect way to describe it. But, that doesn't mean they're not important. These are important. But I think we need to lean into this mysterious aspect. What I've said already, Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. This is the belief at the core of our Christian doctrine, right? You know, we say it when you confess the Apostles' Creed, when you ask someone to say the sinner's prayer, whatever your conception of, salvation, all that might be, the different things that people do to profess their faith. The core of it comes down to the fact that Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. There's all these atonement theories, but those aren't the heart of our belief. You do have some people who try to make usually like some version of the penal substitutionary atonement theory, the cornerstone of their faith. But really, when you try to make a specific theory endeavoring to explain something that occurred in the spiritual realm, naturally speaking, when you try to make that your end-all be-all for faith, you wind up getting yourself in a dangerous point. So we need to sit in this divine mystery. Christ has died. Christ is risen. Christ will come again. What does that do on the inside of you? How does that spur you to action? What does that make you think as a believer? How do you treat your neighbor when he or she cusses you out because you were mowing the lawn and accidentally went over the line? Or true story, when we moved into our house in Connecticut when I was a kid, our second house up there, it was snowing one of the first weekends after we moved in, and me and my brothers went and were sledding, and there was a hill on the side of the house. And in Connecticut, if you don't know, a lot of the houses don't have fences between the houses, and so you have a rather large side yard, and we had this hill in the backyard, and it went down in the back and kind of sloped onto the side to the neighbor's yard. And so we were going and went and sled, and the sled goes and hits the neighbor's flower beds, and we didn't think anything of it. We were just having a good time, and the neighbors come out a little bit later and start yelling at us, and my dad comes out and sends us inside, and they start screaming at him, and a few choice words may have been said. But how do you treat your neighbor then, right, in that situation? With the risen Christ as our example. You see, this is what we need to keep in the forefront of our thinking as we look at this. Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. This is the heart of our faith. You see, because in this confession, when we look at the death and the burial and the resurrection of Jesus, we can see one thing clearly. We can see that the death of Jesus on the cross has forever put to death the notion of retributive violence. Let me say that again. The death of Jesus on the cross has forever put to death the notion of retributive violence. Retributive violence does not solve any problems. We see when people found Jesus and made Jesus out to be the scapegoat, the cause of all these problems wrong with society. It was they screamed, "Give us Barabbas," and Pilate him and the Roman authorities executed Jesus. This violence gets people nowhere. This violence does not solve problems. This violence does not address the answer. It's one of the reasons that, and you can have whatever view you want on it, as a Christian, I am morally against the death penalty. And you say, well, yeah, but they killed somebody. And I do not have the right to take that person's life. Violence begetting violence solves nothing. Violence in response to violence solves nothing. Violence as an attempt to repay one for a wrong they committed does not solve anything. You see, this is what we see in the death of Jesus. I think another thing, and maybe we'll cover this in a future message here, God did not violently murder Jesus on the cross. God did not violently murder Jesus on the cross. You say, well, what do you mean? It says that God's, the wrath of God on Jesus and all these things. Well, what is the wrath of God? We could say that the wrath of God is the consequences for our action, right? There's natural consequences that occur when sin, when injustice, when wrongs are perpetuated in a society. But really, if If God were to take his anger out on Jesus, why would God's standard of behavior be less than what we teach our children? Less than what we show our children how they're to live, how they're to act. No, no, no. Instead, I believe that Jesus willingly came to suffer violence. You see, part of this mystery is why would God, we talked about this a few weeks ago with Archbishop Desmond Tutu, not Desmond Tutu, it was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the suffering God, right? We spoke of the suffering God. Why would God choose to come and enter into the sufferings of humanity? Jesus willingly came. This is the God who comes willingly to suffer violence and to allow the systems, the corrupt systems of power of the world to execute violence on him, to tell us that violence is not the way, to tell us that this is not the way to live, and in accepting all the violence upon himself, continues to forgive. By willingly enduring the violence of humanity and choosing forgiveness, Jesus has put an end to all scapegoating. You see, there's nobody that we can lay fault to for our sins. There's nobody that we can lay fault to for our sins. This is what Jesus did on the cross. He undid the very powers which held us in check. And this is the track of the Bible, honestly. When you read it, you start off with Abraham, and he hears from God that, Abraham, you're to kill Isaac, your son, your only son, whom you love. And Abraham, we think to ourselves, wow, that's a bold ask of God. Abraham had strong faith to believe for that. Well, yes and no. From what I've been able to find, and limited though it may be, Abraham came from a region where, in order to ensure that you had a good harvest of your crop, of your fields, good bounty from your livestock, you would sacrifice your firstborn to the fertility goddess. This is what had to be done in order to ensure a harvest for your people, for your family. And so when Abraham hears God speak to him and tell him, Abraham, sacrifice your son, your only son, whom you love, Abraham thinks to himself, well, of course I've got to sacrifice Isaac. This is what the gods demand. The gods are bloodthirsty and demand the firstborn. And so Abraham takes Isaac up there, and God, stops him from doing this. He stops him from killing him, and Abraham goes and sacrifices this ram instead that he finds in the thicket. And then later on, Moses, in the law there, we see this codified, that animal sacrifice, the shedding of animal blood, is the way that sins are forgiven, that sins are covered over for a time period. And then we get to the prophets, and the prophets challenge this notion entirely. The Psalms, they say, the cattle on 1,000 hills are mine. If I really wanted a sacrifice, I could have gone and got one of them. If I really wanted this, I could have done it. I didn't want it. I desire, all these different things. Let's look over at Psalm chapter 40 and verse 6, and I want to show you I'm not just making this up. Psalm 40 verse 6, he says, you've not desired sacrifice and meal offering. You've opened my ears. You've not required burnt offering and sin offering. This is the psalmist speaking. This is the psalmist telling us that the God who has sacrifice written in the law is not demanding sacrifice. For I desire loyalty, Hosea 6:6, rather than sacrifice, and the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. God would rather us know him than have a burnt offering here. That's interesting. Hebrews 10:4, it's impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. Therefore, when Jesus, comes into the world, he says, you've not desired sacrifice and offering, but you've prepared a body before me. You've not taken pleasure in the whole burnt offerings and offerings for sin. Then I said, behold, I've come. It is written of me in the scroll of the book to do your will, O God. After saying above, sacrifices and offerings, and the whole burnt offerings and offerings for sin you've not desired, nor have you taken pleasure in them, which are according to the law. Do you catch that? He says that God did not desire nor take pleasure in the burnt offerings. Then he said, behold, I've come to do your will. He takes away the first in order to establish the second. So he's saying that Jesus is saying God never had this desire in mind for these burnt offerings. For I desire justice, right? Isn't that what the prophet Micah says? I desired, or is it Micah? I want you to walk humbly, forget I said it. I'm not remembering it at the moment. But we can see that the writers of the New Testament, the writers of the Psalms, the prophets, and there's numerous examples of the prophets. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. When we see these things here, we can see that they're challenging the very notion of a burnt sacrifice to begin with. The sacrifice itself is not what's appeasing to God. That's kind of this idea that we've understood, is that Jesus is the sacrifice to appease God's divine bloodlust, and in so doing, Jesus' sacrifice allows us to walk in salvation. But Jesus isn't a sacrifice in that he appeased God. You see, he wasn't some sort of divine anti-anger medication. Jesus wasn't there to change God's nature on the cross. No, Jesus was revealing the God who always was. Pastor Brian Zahn says it this way, that God looks like Jesus. God has always looked like Jesus. We have not always known what God looks like, but now we do. You see, we know what God looks like because we see Jesus. And when Jesus is on the cross, Jesus' entire perspective is that he is reconciling all of the world to God. This is what we see in 2 Corinthians, that he was reconciling the whole world to himself, that he's bringing all of humanity. He's reconciling. Jesus is doing all the reconciliation work himself. And even as he was crucified, he demonstrates divine, free, radical forgiveness. That's one of the things, like we teach our kids to forgive this way, right? If somebody goes and, takes a toy and, or hits somebody or whatever, kids are crazy. But, we teach them that forgiveness when they've been wronged, you don't need to be hurt again necessarily, with natural relationships, but forgiveness is your responsibility. It's not based on if the other person's apologized. You are the one who makes the choice to forgive, and you forgive not because of what it does for them, but because of what it does for you. Because forgiving is good for you. And so we see Jesus on the cross, and he as he's on the cross, he says, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. They don't know what they're doing. Forgive them for what they're doing. Did they ask for forgiveness? Did they say, well, once we finish the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross, then we can finally receive our forgiveness? No, not at all. Not at all. This is not the picture we see at the cross. And I'm purposely, not trying to explain exactly what it is that occurs. Number one, because I don't know it all. But number two, because I think there's some good questions to ask. I think there's some good pieces that we might not understand that we want to continue to lean into. And Jesus, as he sheds his blood on the cross, becomes the perfect embodiment for the forgiveness that you and I are to live, for the forgiveness that you and I are to demonstrate and to walk in. Jesus shows us as he takes the suffering of humanity on himself, comes into the whole of human experience, and instead of bringing judgment and condemnation and guilt and shame on the very people who crucified him, on the very people who hung him on the cross, Jesus instead prays, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. This is really a picture of divine love. This is a picture of the love of God towards all humanity. This is a picture of exactly the kind of being that God is. God is in the business of welcoming people back into relationship. The door is open. God has opened the door. Will you come back into relationship is the question. This is the picture of what Jesus shows on the cross. The door is open, and we see the thief on his one side who receives it, right? That the door is open. Will you receive what I'm offering to you this day? And that's what Jesus does on the cross. That's what it means to not even what it means. That's not the right word. And forgive me, I'm still stumbling and learning new ways to think about this as I'm growing in my faith journey, as I'm growing in my walk with the Lord. And this is where we begin to see the example of the divine love of God, the example of pure love on display from on high, God revealing, or Jesus revealing the way that God always was. This is what it's all about. This is what our faith is. It hangs on the cross like Jesus. Our faith hangs on the cross like Jesus. Amen. And we're out of time. We'll see you next week.